Hello, you're all very welcome. Thank you very much for coming to see me. I don't think really there's a face in the room that doesn't know me, except maybe the back two. I'm Tomas, Kavanagh, a senior. I'm an environmental science major. I have co-founded and presided over the International House here at Trinity for 2 years. And now I'm presenting before you. I'm not sure if most of you here just to maybe laugh at me and see me do this, but I'm a little bit more rusty since the last time I gave this presentation. Well, my essay was a very long-winded title, Critical Issues Relating to the Development of Sustainable Ecotourism in Chinese Nature Reserves. Before I continue, maybe I should ask, does anyone have any definition of ecotourism for me? Huh? I know Nick Bacon will, though. I'm glad I know my audience.
Ecotourism is the use of just touring ecological areas. Nature.
Okay, yes.
It's in the title.
Alright, anyway, the point is,
it's a consumption of nature.
Yeah, it's a very conflicted term, alright? It's very controversial in how it's practiced. Anyone doesn't really have the real definition of what it is because it's practiced in so many ways. The International Ecotourism Society defines it as responsible travel to natural areas and that conserves the environment and improves the well-being of local people. However, this is a very, as I said, this is a conflicting idea, and many people see it as this, many people see it as the idea of maybe just sustainability, preserve what we have now so the future generations can also enjoy it. However, other people just see it as a product solely to be marketed to the tourist industry. So you might just have a mountain, and rather than think of any kind of conservational ideas for this mountain, you're simply going to sell it to tourists and exploit it for whatever economic benefit that you can actually have. It has a relevance, a broader Chinese relevance to the development dialogue in China because it's related to issues such as unequal regional distribution, especially in land, environmental degradation, energy demand and social unrest. And considering the huge growth in tourism in China at the moment, all these natural areas that are benefiting economically from ecotourism are also at risk of considerable degradation. So yes, this looks quite long-winded here, so I'm going to try and do it as quick as possible. Also, I practiced this earlier and it was about a 45-minute presentation, so I'm going to try and cut it down. Alright? Basically, the past century, China has undergone two dramatic systemic changes. First, the Socialist Revolution led by Mao Zedong in about 1949, and the subsequent economic reforms led by Deng Xiaoping in 1970 onwards. What we had is a transformation in China from one of the poorest countries in the world into the economic powerhouse that we all know today. That doesn't mean that a significant portion of the population actually are poor rural dwellers, but there is a lot of movement towards cities, and it is the economic powerhouse that we now know. Despite greatly differing policies between these two leaders, differing policies and rhetoric, both regimes have left quite destructive environmental legacies. So we have Mao moving the economy towards a centrally planned economy with resource-intensive industries at the heart of it, all of them associated with severe inefficiencies. Basically, he was denying development strategy catered to China's comparative strengths. You see expanded agricultural output targets without any regard for constraints, so you have huge vast swaths of forest being cut down so that they can increase agricultural output. This got rid of traditional farming practices such as sustainable tilling, water control, sequential harvesting. We actually, in China ourselves, when we were there, we visited, you want to tell us about what we visited, Henry, considering you were on TV for it?
Sure. The natural sewage treatment facility?
Yeah.
It was a kind of a series of terraced artificial marshes that were used to filter sewage from a local small village. And by the end, it got through 7 or so of these artificial marshes. By the end, it was drinkable or potable.
Yeah, and they're growing tilapia and they could fish from it. Yeah, it was quite interesting. So, added to that, there's a very inefficient distribution of heavy industry. So, different cities were allotted a certain type of industry, whether or not they were it was ideally suited towards the economy of the area. and this actually caused a tripling of the energy per unit output. Also in this period you saw no true environmental legislation. So what we did have was something like environmental hygiene, which came in. It was a Soviet-inspired concept which really just looked at air and water pollution in the cities itself, but didn't actually affect the rural population in any way. Also, it was a period of censorship and scientific, not that it's too good right now either, although things are changing slowly. So scientists who criticised the environmental policies would often be subject to political labelling and ostracism. Also, you have to think of this period that environmental awareness wasn't that fashionable, I guess, an idea at the time. And so the ideas to limits of growth that we see now, whether we can go into this area and simply extract what we can from it without thinking about the local environment, whether or not it's sustainable, it was a different period back then. So these kind of concepts weren't widespread. And in general, Mao saw the forest as a free good to be taken. Now, despite all this, Deng's policy didn't technically improve much at all. He basically led socialism with Chinese characteristics, which was a means by which to open up the economy, and that would push forward the economic reform that we saw. So we saw a movement towards light industry away from heavy. And we had something called TVEs, which were town village enterprises, which were somewhat state-funded for people in different villages to set up their own enterprises and their own entrepreneurial opportunities. We also saw increased competition between the industries that were already there, and this focused on top-line expenses such as energy bills. So what you eventually saw is 2.3 times less energy per unit output by 2000. There also was a period where increased awareness of pollution in China itself. So you saw some constitutional, legislative, environmental protection by 1982. By 1983, environmental protection was fundamental state policy in China. And you saw a vast expansion of environmental institutions, laws, and policies. Nevertheless, it ended up being more polluted at the end than at the beginning. Scientists often focus on forests due to their ecosystem services and the negative impacts associated with their loss. So they often prioritise forest cover in a country. Despite massive afforestation projects at the time, during the 80s in China, there was still about a 10% loss of forest cover during this period, and really what this was attached to was some illegal logging, poor fire facilities, fraud, and bad management in general. This is also something which you'll see recurring throughout the nature reserves themselves, which is one of the problems with ecotourism actually being managed there. Then in general you had the local population prioritising economic growth over environmental protection itself. And those TVEs that were so helpful in reducing the energy output, a lot of them were actually in highly polluting areas such as paper and chemical production. So these people also didn't care too much about, when they got their economic benefit, where the waste from this paper and chemical production went, and it ended up resulting in a threefold increase in chemical fertilizers on the farming land. Also in the last 10 years we've seen a return to investment-led energy-intensive industrialization, so a return to heavy industry again. What complicates it even further, China's environmental efforts even further, is the fact that 80% of electricity is actually coal-generated, and China is now one of the largest emitters also of CO2. Okay, so the growth of the Chinese nature reserve. Due to their carbon sequestration capabilities, immense biodiversity, essential resources, and basically ecosystem services, the forests are the most important ecosystem in China itself. Despite the fact that Mao considered them free goods to be taken, some scientists did actually manage to set up the first foundations of the modern nature reserve system in China. So scientists did manage to convinced the Third National People's Conference in 1956 to set up some nature reserves, and 19 were actually set up at that period. However, this was completely stopped during the Cultural Revolution from 1970.